Hello, and welcome to Zarvot, a game about cubes. Let's go ahead and jump right in, and I'll explain some of the game as we get through this first chapter. So, this game has 12 chapters, and most of them have boss fights, and a lot of them have enemies that we have to fight. So, right off the bat, we have to fight a small wave of enemies. We have a variety of moves. Mostly used our radial beam and pew pew. As you can see, every time you hit an enemy, the game lags slightly. Depending on the strength of the attack or the damage that you deal, the game actually lags more or less. So a lot of the fights in the game are mostly about optimizing which attack you're using and making sure that you're not wasting a lot of time just throwing out attacks. As you can see here, this is the first boss of the game. It's more of a mini-boss, and we actually kind of see him again later. But the idea here is just keep hitting him, keep hitting him, keep hitting him, keep hitting him. Eventually his health bar dies. There's not much to see. And we get to see a little bit of our two main characters, Charcoal and Red. So that's about all the fighting that we do in Chapter 1, even though there are a couple areas where we could be fighting. And I'll get into that closer to that area. But to start out with, we actually have one small skip that we can do. So we have to grab two items, one the keys and two the present, and then head out the door. But if you space it very precisely, you can actually skip grabbing the present and make the game think that you've grabbed it and go out the door. Here we jump over the door usually to skip a little bit of going down the stairs. The stairs are probably the most annoying aspect of the entire game, especially going up them. And you can actually just jump over the door to avoid one flight of them. So here, normally we would actually have to fight a wave of enemies here and we'd be blocked in, but utilizing a technique called Stairway to Heaven, abbreviated STH, we can actually jump over the majority of the wave triggers in the entire game, which saves a lot of time because combat is very slow. Here we jump over a cutscene trigger that would normally introduce Mustard, but we meet him here anyway. So Mustard is very peppy and excitable and random, and so he's sort of your helper and motivation throughout the game, and he also just chats with you a lot. So here we do have another fight. It's very simple though. We stand around and hit enemies and then go back to Mustard. But we have to take the jar to the next chapter. Jars are one method of transportation in the game. And as you can see here, we basically just sit and spin. The spinning attack is actually the least laggy out of all the attacks, and it deals pretty consistent damage even if an enemy has multiple hits worth of health. You can just sort of sit there and sit on top of it spinning, and it'll slowly take damage and die. Here we can actually skip a cutscene that launches the jar into the air, and now we just have a little bit of dialogue. So now that I have a chance, I'll sort of explain how Stairway to Heaven works. One of the abilities you can use is sort of a barrier that normally blocks enemies and attacks, but because the barrier itself has a collision, you can also jump on it, which opens up a lot of different out-of-bounds tricks, or just skipping cutscene triggers and wave triggers. So right here at the start of Chapter 2, we'll be utilizing that to just avoid some of the more annoying movement here. Before this trick, we would actually jump off an enemy and go out of bounds, but here, as you can see, we can just jump over the jar and go out. And we'll be doing basically the same thing in this section. We'll be jumping out of the normal area for the game, and we'll be sort of going almost into the background. And this skips multiple waves of enemies that you can actually see we go underneath, Anywhere that's sort of a square or rectangular area with a little bit of terrain is probably a wave. So this is another area where we go out of bounds. We actually do about 10 stairs and then jump onto the barrier for the out of bounds, and then we jump off one more barrier so that we can get just enough distance to land on the next out of bounds barrier and go into this elevator. This elevator has an unavoidable wave since it's basically a cutscene in itself. And so we basically just have to sit here and fight. The only way to save time is to kill all the enemies very quickly and to not take damage. Because just like how the game lags a bit when enemies take damage, the game also lags a lot when you take damage. So as you can see, we use a lot of pew pew, we use a lot of the spinning attack on enemies with multiple hit points. And when our spacing lines up very well for multiple enemies, we can also use radial beam, which pretty much will one-shot almost any enemy in the game. The orange enemies that are spiky around are also immune to our spin attack, but they're not immune to pew pew and radial beam, so you'll notice that we usually try to finish those off with something else. Now that the elevator is done, we have a couple of waves that we can skip. So we'll be just jumping over these wave triggers, and you will see this a lot during the run. Pretty much any wave that we can skip using this, and we can't skip any other way, we will be doing a Stairway to Heaven to get out of it. Because it takes about 5, maybe 10 seconds to jump over the wave trigger, and it takes upwards of a minute, sometimes 2 or 3 even, to actually fight the wave. So here we actually don't have access to our combat abilities, so we have to do all movement here. So we'll actually jump over the second bit of dialogue, kind of similar to what we did with Mustard earlier, where he complains about the coffee shop being closed. And we're actually going to go grab a cup, since this cube wants his coffee, and the coffee shop is closed because there are no cups. And we're going to go talk to this ladybug, and the ladybug will explain to us, oh yeah, I closed the coffee shop because we ran out of cups. How convenient that we just grabbed a cup to use. Are we friends with Green? Do all cubes know each other? The real questions are being asked here. So here, we're basically just going to talk and talk and talk and then skip a cutscene. It's important to get as close to the ladybug as possible for that first cutscene because you have to interact with him in order to get the next cutscene to start. And here we can skip this cutscene and we will go straight to a boss fight. This is the first real boss fight of the game, and it poses a very, very important question to our players. Oh banana, great banana. Can we have a banana? And the banana asks, are you worthy? So if you weren't aware of how to spell banana, now you know, because the normal spelling is incorrect. So with all boss fights, the first damage that you deal is actually a large chunk of their health, and then they usually spawn enemies and go into periods of vulnerability where you can just spam them, and then they'll move around so that it's much harder to hit them. But usually it's still possible to hit them even while they're moving, it's just more annoying. So normally you would want to get rid of all the enemies in order to get it to fall back down, but sometimes it's just faster to keep hitting it while it's moving. So now that we've beaten the first boss, we have one of the most difficult tricks in the entire game. You have to actually add each boss's item into the present, which we didn't get a chance to see before because we skipped it, but now we do. The reason this is hard is because you have to remember to hold the control stick and actually put the item into the briefcase. So coming up next is a very long auto-scroller, so in a GDQ setting this would be a very good time for donations. we basically sit at the bottom right of the screen, and there's almost a 0% chance that you actually get hit by any of these blocks. If you do get hit, you take damage, and obviously it lags the game, and in theory you can die, but there's really not much to do. And the bottom right, almost nothing will hit you. It's very rare. Since this is a submission video and wouldn't have any donations, I'll take this chance to sort of briefly go over the story of the game. So Charcoal and Mustard are trying to create a present for their friend Red because it's his birthday coming up. And so as you can see, they've collected all these different items and stuffed them into a briefcase to give to Red as a present. Some of the items in the briefcase, like the rubber duck, the crayon, the mochi, actually foreshadow some of the bosses that you'll have to fight later on in the game. Now the auto-scroller is finished, and we learn that Mustard has no sense of time and really wants his banana bread. So, unfortunately, it's not good to try to eat banana bread and ride a skateboard at the same time. So they crash. So now we check the present and notice that all the items are gone, except for the mochi, which is melted, so we can't really use it anyway. We check the present before we talk to Mustard because it actually skips one interaction with Mustard when he asks how the present is doing. And we see kind of similar skips in a few other sections of the run where talking to certain characters or objects in a certain order will be able to skip interactions. But now we don't know the present, so obviously we can't give it to Red, whose birthday is tomorrow. So we're going to have to figure out something else. However, in Chapter 3, it's all cutscenes. So what we miss here is that Mustard actually dresses up in a present box, and we try to give Mustard as a present to Red. But we miss all of that because it's all considered cutscenes, even though you move throughout most of it. And now we see one of the hardest movement sections in the game, going upstairs. The stairs are very aggressive, and so you basically jump and dash at the same time, and that's the best way to get up them. As you can see, there's also like a little bar that moves up behind me. That's the stamina bar. So every action takes a little bit of your stamina, and so eventually you won't even be able to jump or dash or shoot or attack otherwise if you run your stamina all the way out, which is very important because you want to be going fast, you want to be taking every action you can. So stamina management is really important, especially in movement. That's why a lot of the time you'll see me do 3 quick dashes and then take a break, and then 3 quick dashes and then a break. So now we've got Chapter 4. This is really where we start to notice a lot of the wave skips, because we have to do a lot of individual wave skips here. So this first section, usually the first section doesn't have an actual wave, it just has a lot of enemies. This is true in a lot of chapters, so we can just sort of skip all of it. And you might have noticed that the game lagged a little bit back there. That's because Red is actually joining us in this chapter, and Red can fight enemies as well. So we want to not only get through the level as fast as possible, we want to do it before Red can have a chance to slow the game down by attacking the enemies that we're avoiding. So over here, we have to jump all the way over this wave trigger, and Red will actually activate the wave and get stuck in there and try to fight stuff, which can sometimes mess up our inputs while we're doing other waves in this chapter. But this one is a much shorter skip, so we can just go right through. So in this section, like I said, Red can mess you up, and I actually do end up messing up this particular wave skip. You need to get 5 high and make sure to get a really good double jump at the top to skip over the entire wave. I unfortunately did not, so I activated the wave. In most cases, it's faster to just restart the level and try the wave skip again, rather than actually fighting through the entire wave, Because not only do you have to get through all the enemies, you have to get through all the enemies. So beating the enemies lags the game, and having to fight the enemies to begin with is already slow. The second section, however, does not actually have a wave barrier, so you can just sort of go through it. Here, there are 4 laser walls. You have 4 health, so you need to actually jump over or past one of them in order to not die, and you can just ignore the damage for the rest of the section. So here, since taking damage is slow, it's actually faster to take a small out of bounds there and get it back in. I feel like that's almost intentional because those 2 openings are very specific, but it is kind of a more difficult trick to get back in than it is to get back out. Here again, we'll be skipping 3 waves, so we have to go Stairway to Heaven 4 times over the first 2, and then we'll have to do a couple more to get over this next one. And as you can see, Red is lagging the game because he's fighting enemies further back. So now we've got our height, we can jump over here. We can do a small skip here by jumping over this fence rather than going all the way around. And now we have sort of a midpoint of the chapter where there would be a cutscene where Red gets eaten by the mochi. There's one leftover mochi and we're fighting over it, and it turns into a giant monster and eats Red. So now we have to save Red. We can skip all these enemies, but this next wave is actually one of the only waves in the game that you just straight up cannot get over the wave trigger for. Or it's possible that you can, but it's actually just faster to fight the enemies. So this is a good example of just general combat early on. And here, luckily, we can get over this one because otherwise it is a very long wave compared to the previous one. We actually have to take 11 barriers up to jump over the wave trigger. And you'll sort of see this weird bus in the background with glowing eyes. One of the coolest things about going out of bounds in this game is you get to see a lot of the scenery that is kind of hard to notice with the camera restricted the way it is. But now we have our boss fight, the Mochi. So again, you see the very first hit takes out a giant chunk of damage, and we're basically just going to corner it and shoot it over and over and over until it dies. It'll spawn a couple of enemies, but I mean, they're not very mobile, so we just keep cornering it. It can jump out of the corner, but once it's in the corner, it's really hard to get out, which is good for us because we can just shoot it from there. So now we've broken Red out, and the chapter is basically over it. And to denote that the chapter is over, we get a score. Not all the chapters end with a score like this. Some of them we actually end up skipping because of a cutscene. But it's usually a good spot to split in some chapters. Here, I actually messed up a couple of the cutscene skips because I was trying to scroll my notes down. But as you can see, I hit restart level by misinputting one down input. But this chapter starts off with multiple skips of cutscenes. Some of the cutscenes we can't skip, so we just have to sit here and mash the text. Once again, skipping a cutscene where we would have visited the mochi bar and they would tell us, hey, you can refreeze your mochi here, because we're out of mochi right now due to the mochi festival. So again, we're going to be using a lot of out of bounds and just sort of getting up on the terrain to avoid enemies and waves. Here technically we learn one of the special abilities, which is called Chomp, but we don't actually need it. Certain enemies have sort of armor that makes them immune to anything that isn't Chomp or Radial Beam. So we have to clear the armor with Radial Beam before we can actually deal damage to them. This section is basically the same skip as the very first section. We just get up onto the wall and avoid the wave. And it's a similar skip here, we just have to get a little bit higher and skip 2 waves instead of 1. So we get up here on this wall. We'll activate the first wave, but it doesn't matter because we're too high up. The Second wave, however, we need to get very high to avoid it because the cutscene trigger is very wide. So we actually just have to sort of blindly jump down here until we get to the end of the level. This is probably the most difficult section in this chapter. It is heavily movement oriented, and the optimal path, you basically just have to know your dash distance and the optimal inputs to use, because anytime you fall off here, you just die instantly. There's no recovering. That movement, as you can see, also did skip a couple of waves, one of them even activated. Here, we have to avoid one wave, and we actually end up needing to avoid some enemies that fall down from the sky after the wave. There's actually a really funny out of bounds on the other side of this wave, but unfortunately you can't get back in a useful way, so it's just faster to do this. In this section, we really just jump directly out of bounds. It doesn't matter that the wave activated because there's no barrier on the left, and then we can just go around this other wall and to the end of the level. So initially this section had a lot of individual wave skips and then a lot of movement, but you can actually jump up onto the boundaries of the level and pretty much ride it almost all the way to the end. There's one section you'll see we sort of dip down and then have to jump back up, and we're getting onto the second boundary, and then we fall back inbounds, and we have to find a good place to land and continue for the end of the level, where we'll skip all of these enemies. That brings us to our next boss, the Frozen Milk. This is actually one of the tougher bosses in the game, mostly because it has the ice cubes. These ice cubes sort of jump off of the y-axis, and all of your attacks are basically on the plane that you're on, so you can't attack above you or below you. So the ice cubes jump around and are generally annoying to hit, and they can come in at full speed, so it's difficult to tell if you're going to get hit or not. It's usually best to just take this boss pretty safely and avoid everything, because you can get sort of dogpiled by the ice cubes, and that becomes very difficult to survive. Overall, aside from taking a little bit of damage, it was a pretty good fight. And now that the boss has been defeated, we can utilize the deep refreezer. Since our mochi was melted, it's kind of flat and gross looking, but now we can refreeze it, and it'll be a mochi again. And now that we've got our mochi, we're going to have to add it to the present. Again, another difficult trick. We have to actually hold the control stick in a certain direction until it hovers directly over the hole in the briefcase that the mochi fits into. For the first 4 presents, they're all in the top right, after the banana, of course. So it's pretty easy to remember at least the direction that you need to go. There we skip another cutscene, and that cutscene actually has the end of chapter score, so we never get our chapter 5 score. So if you happen to care about any of your individual level stats, don't skip that cutscene, because otherwise you'll never find out how long it took, and the game will actually never update it. So here we have to talk to Red, and this is the first real interaction that we get to see with Red where we can't skip any of the text. So here we actually learn that Red is kind of depressed. You don't really learn it, but you can tell just by how he sort of bends forward. Says it's late, he's tired, he doesn't want to do anything. And you might start to think, you're going on all these adventures with Mustard to get a present for Red, and you're not taking Red on any of your adventures. So now most of the rest of the chapters end by getting in bed, and then you'll have a short cutscene where you can't sleep, which is usually unskippable, and then the next chapter will begin after you go out the door. So this upcoming chapter is called Zen Street, and It's overall a pretty relaxing chapter, which is good that it's named Zen Street. The reason it's relaxing is because most of this chapter, the levels just don't really exist. We already saw in previous chapters that you could skip a lot of most of the sections, or if you couldn't skip the section itself, you could generally skip the waves within it. But in Zen Street, you can pretty much skip every part of every section by going out of bounds very quickly. So at the very start, there's actually a cutscene that you can skip by jumping over the arrow onto that first step. And it's just extra dialogue with yellow that, it's easy to avoid, so we might as well. Here, we literally just go dash. There's nothing to do there. There are a lot of fun out of bounds, but there's nothing to avoid, so you just go through. So here, this is the start where you see, it's very easy to get out of bounds. We only need one barrier, and we actually avoid like 3 or 4 different waves with that trick. There's 2 waves in this section, and again, we're just going to jump on a barrier and go outside. This one I actually messed up, so you can see it's very easy to fall back in bounds if you're not careful. But again, it is faster to just try again than to fight the wave in the vast majority of situations. And here, again, like I said, this chapter kind of does not exist. There would have been a lot of mazes that we had to get through, and we would have learned about the gates that we have to press a button to activate, but we just kind of avoid them. Normally you have to radial beam to activate them through the gate, but we can just go past them. So here we actually skip a decent bit of platforming just by jumping up here, and then we'll skip a couple of waves. Up here, depending on how you're feeling, you can do 3 or 4 stairs here. If you take 4 stairs, you can jump all the way over the gate, but you can also land on the button or just do another barrier to get over it. Here there's a wave. This is one of the few in the game where we just avoid it entirely. We say, oh, it activated, oh well. And here we can just skip one little pass by jumping out of bounds again. In this section, we're going to jump over a few gates, and then we're going to skip another wave. Normally, again, you would have to radial beam these sort of little armored buttons, and then radial beam them again to activate the gate, but we can just jump over the gates. It doesn't really matter to us. So now we're starting to come up on the boss fight. This is sort of the entrance to the boss area, or the entrance to the boss area. It's a little bit quicker to just jump out of bounds directly to the end of the section rather than having to take a path all the way around. And we're actually going to avoid buying a ticket and talking to this big gummy bear and just go straight to the boss fight. So Ultra Duck starts with armor, and then you just have to sort of mash and kill him. His only attack is to shoot flames at you. Sometimes he'll shoot out flames that just sort of sit around, and those can actually block shots, but he is overall pretty predictable. You can tell when he's going to aim at you. However, that's not the end of Ultra Duck. We actually have to fight him a second time, and we're impatient, so we're going to go straight there by going out of bounds and then jumping back in bounds where his boss fight starts. Again, you have to clean off his armor and start attacking him. It's basically the same boss fight as before, but he spawns more enemies. These little spheres we actually would have learned about in Chapter 5, but we skipped most of them. They sort of generate a ring hitbox if you happen to bump into them or attack them. So that was Ultra Duck 2. Overall, a pretty good fight despite taking a lot of damage. I was very close to dying there. And of course, as with every boss, we have to make sure to put the present in the briefcase, the hardest trick in the run. And got it. So oftentimes, kind of between chapters, we'll go visit Red, and it's mostly the middle chapters where, you know, we've already fought the boss, we've gotten our sort of end score, but the next chapter hasn't started yet because we want to go make sure Red is doing okay, and we'll tell him how we've been doing. So this is very similar to the previous chapter's Red discussion, where we get up on the couch and talk. And you can kind of tell the pain that Red is going through. You know, best friends going off on all these cool adventures, and Red doesn't know that they're doing this to get him a present. Red just thinks they've been doing all this cool stuff without him for no reason. It is interesting to note that sometimes you can actually spawn underneath the floor during these Red sections, which is kind of unfortunate because you just automatically die, which is a waste of time. And also, if you press buttons while trying to get up onto the couch, it prevents you from getting on the couch and initiating the cutscene. So once again, you're having trouble sleeping. But we eventually fall asleep, and the next chapter will begin. So, as much as I said that Zen Street as a chapter basically doesn't exist, Chapter 7 also kind of doesn't exist. It's easily the most linear chapter in the game. You can basically hold upright for the entire chapter with very little other movement involved. And we're basically just going to skip all the puzzles that were intended. So, you know, we've got a little bit of terrain to jump over, some weird boxes. The first section, as usual, does not have very much in it. It's just sort of to introduce you to the area. The aesthetic, the platforming. And here, we would normally have to unlock these gates with these glowing key blocks. But gates are very short. We can just jump over them. And this is true in every single section in this chapter. There's key blocks, but we don't need them. We can just jump over the gate. Before the Stairway to Heaven was found, most of these we would actually manipulate an enemy to come over, and we would jump over the gate anyway. So it's not a huge time save, but it's there. Here, we don't even need to use a barrier for some of these. We can just jump over the existing terrain. In some of these sections, it's actually possible to get out of bounds and land on the wall and walk along it, but that's generally slower than just jumping over the gates individually. Normally, you would have to sort of escort that car with the keys on it throughout each wave, but we just kind of ignore it. And coming up is one of the more difficult boss fights for a beginner, but once you learn how to optimize it, it becomes surprisingly simple. So this is the Crayon Spider, aptly named because it is a crayon box with spider legs. And so it basically takes your radial beam attack and focuses on it. During the first phase of the fight, most of these are just at a predetermined distance or radius from Crayon Spider, but once he's under half health, it actually starts to center on you, so you have to be moving to avoid it. As you can see, these are getting smaller, but if you really just dash directly in or out towards the Crayon Spider, they're never going to hit you. He also spawns some darker circles, which you can detonate separately, which are kind of intended to just trap you, but as long as you don't stand directly on top of them, like I did right there, you're never going to get hit by them because they're not active most of the time. And overall, aside from the damage at the very end, that was a pretty good Crayon Spider fight. As you can see, it's a very short chapter. However, like many of the chapters in this part of the game, it has a very difficult trick at the very end of it. You have to put crayon into the present. Again, hold up right, and it goes in. So once again, we're going to go visit Red because we're very worried and we want to make sure that he's doing okay. However, this time Red isn't here. So there's not really much we can do, aside from go home. This definitely is not worrying at all. One of the interesting things about this game is that they travel by subway, car, and jar, but mostly the subway. So once again, this chapter technically ends with having difficulty sleeping, and it will transition into... It's definitely more of a chapter than what we've been seeing the last 10-15 minutes. There's a lot more movement to take into account, and some enemies that we have to fight, and a lot of waves that we get to skip. We also learn, in terms of the story, that Red is becoming more and more detached from charcoal and mustard, but we're determined to make sure that that isn't an issue. So here in North Talks, we're going to start off by, again, avoiding as many enemies as we can. There aren't really any waves in this first section, as is common in the game, but there are some things that we have to avoid. And here, we generally try to jump over this gate with either an enemy or a barrier, whichever you think is faster. Optimally, it's better if an enemy happens to be in the right place at the right time, but the enemies are kind of unpredictable, so that's not always guaranteed. Here, we kill this enemy just for safety because it fires a homing shot that can actually destroy our barriers while we're jumping or hit us off of it. But we're going to skip a wave here. It activated, but we still got through. Again, we're going to skip this wave. We're going to jump up here, and I actually end up failing the skip. This one's tough because there's not really a good place to set it up easily. Unfortunately, it's easiest to get it into a corner so that the barriers, which actually move forward slightly over time, so that they can't move anywhere, and you can just stand on them normally. But in there, the only corners are kind of at awkward angles for where you actually have to get through to avoid the wave. Also, in some of these sections, you can throw a barrier out while you're falling from your previous Stairway to Heaven, just to save a little bit of time. So here, rather than take the corner again, I do a little bit further up. As you can see, the barriers sort of move a little bit, but I got through that time. And again, here, there's no good corner, so we just kind of have to get it against a wall. It's also easiest to land on them if they're directly at about a 90-degree angle to the screen, so that you only have to worry about getting one sort of angle or distance on it, rather than trying to line it up in sort of 2 dimensions. So here, you can make it over with just 5 barriers, but I usually do a 6th one just for safety, and also it makes it much easier to get over this gate with that same jump. You can just barely make it with 5 if you have very good movement, but you also don't want to activate the wave because that would waste a lot of time. So here, I actually got hit twice, which is very unusual. You want to jump off this block and go over the gate like that. Normally that enemy would not be hitting you, but as you can see, the homing missile is very, very annoying. So here, we're just going to jump over these gates again, avoid some more enemies. That's sort of the theme in this chapter, and a lot of the chapters is, hey, here's a gate. Oh, actually, instead of opening it, I'm just going to jump over it because you allowed me to. here, it's pretty normal to get hit by these ice cubes because, you know, you can't even see where they're attacking you from most of the time. But they have a pretty difficult time getting up to you once you get on top. So I would say on average I take 1 to 2 damage there. It's also very difficult to hit them before they can hit you, since they sort of bounce off the ground, so it's just kind of expected to take damage. So here, like I said, the ice cubes are really annoying, and this fight employs a lot of them. You actually have to kill many ice cubes before you can even start the boss fight, and one of them is armored, which means you have to radial beam before you can actually deal damage to it. Here, I honestly have no idea what this boss is, but basically its attacks are a series of missiles that will stick into you, and if you get hit, you guaranteed take damage. It shoots missiles in packs of 3, which means if you're not careful, you can die in effectively 2 rounds of hits from it. So here, again, the ice cubes are really annoying to hit. They can be hit with your spin attack, but they also have a high chance of hitting you in that case. A lot of the enemies, or a lot of the boss fights that have sort of a lateral attack, you usually just move perpendicular to them while they're aiming at you, and then there's not much they can do, and you just attack over and over and over. Sometimes you can get this boss to be cornered, and then he can't dash before he attacks you, so it gets a lot easier to kill him. But other than that, it's just a pretty standard fight. And now we've got our metal ice cube. So again, hardest trick, we have to put it into the present. Unfortunately, this is the last item that we have to put on the right side of the present, so the next present we get, we have to actually remember to put it on the left side, which is very difficult. So now Mustard and Charcoal are kind of just talking about what they have to do next. As you can see, I took a lot of damage there. Not great, but I at least restarted the level before I died, which is slightly faster than accepting the death, because you take the damage, you take the death animation. If you know you're going to die for sure, you might as well just reset. So again, we're checking on Red, and Red's still not home. So unfortunately, we'll have to come back another day. Once again, taking the subway. And Chapter 9 is coming up, which is kind of an odd chapter. It's one of the only chapters where you go through a level and then you sort of go back. Most of the time, you sort of progress through an entire area and then eventually you get to a boss fight. But in Baskertine Galleries, you actually progress through the entire area and fight no enemies on your first pass through. And then you have to come back through, and it's just waves and waves of enemies. So here, you can do a little bit of platforming to skip the stairs with a barrier, but it doesn't really save that much time. It's more just for swag. It's good to keep in mind the terrain while you're coming back, because you have to do it all in reverse, while also avoiding enemies and waves. You can actually get out of bounds here as well, but we really just walk straight to this area, so it's kind of pointless. So here, this is a very aggressive wave trigger. It actually activates, but the barrier isn't high enough, so we can still get over it if it activates. But it's kind of hard to tell sometimes. And you can get sort of sucked back in and have to fight the wave, so it's faster to just restart. So here we'll go down a bit, and then we'll actually just jump out of bounds and skip this area entirely. One of the odd things here is that we actually have to fall back in bounds. Usually you just land on top of the trigger for the next area. And here, once again, we're going to get up onto some terrain, and then we'll be jumping out of bounds rather than fighting a wave. And like I mentioned at the very start of the game, there was a mini-boss. We would have actually had to fight that mini-boss again here, the same one, but we just skipped the wave, so we don't have to fight him at all. And that's Baskertine Galleries. As you can see, it's a pretty fast section in general, just because of the sheer amount that we have to skip. And now we put the CD in. However, that section also introduced some enemies that normally in your regular gameplay you would be seeing a lot more of them. They're these sort of wisps. We don't interact with very many of them, but they'll sort of break up into multiple enemies when you kill them. So now, in Chapter 10, this is where we kind of get sick of having to skip waves individually a lot. There are some very difficult wave skips, and some sections that would have 2 or 3 waves to skip with a very, very tall stairway, like 10 plus barriers. So in some of these cases, it actually became faster to just continually climb up until you could get out of bounds and skip the entire section, rather than having to skip the individual sections. So you also have a few sections in this chapter where we just sort of avoid the wave. Here the barrier activates, but it's actually not centered properly, so we just kind of walk along the edge of it. And we're basically just going to run through and skip some waves in here. There is a little bit more movement too. There is actually a second way to skip this wave without doing a Stairway to Heaven, which is going down the bottom path. There's a section where you can get out of bounds and just sort of walk around it, but the stairway is faster, as it usually is. This section is all about movement. There are no actual waves. It's kind of just a game of trying to stay on these pillars while you move between sections. It's not a big deal if you fall down because you can just get a barrier and jump off of it. But casually, it's kind of difficult to figure that out. So here, this is the first section where we're really sick of having to skip these waves individually. The wave triggers in this section in particular are very aggressive, so it's really just easier to jump all the way out of bounds and then skip the entire wave and sort of explore our way back in bounds for the end of the level. This is kind of an awkward area because we have to do a lot of this almost blind, because there's no good indicators of where the barriers for the level are. So here we can actually just skip the wave that's coming up by walking. And then we can avoid the rest of the enemies. There's actually kind of a unique enemy in here. It has a barrier and it'll shoot you from behind it. But it's kind of unfortunate that we just skip all of these cool enemies. Here, this is one of the highest barrier or Stairway to Heavens that we have in the run. It might just be the highest, but there are 3 very tall Stairway to Heavens that we have to get through to skip the waves themselves. So at that point, it really is just faster to go all the way out of bounds and do 1 stairway. And then, again, we just kind of have to blindly go up here and assume that we're going to make it back in eventually. We actually just go back around from the back. In this section, pretty commonly right before a boss level, there will just be a bunch of enemies that you have to avoid. There's no actual waves, but there's just a ton of enemies that spawn. Here, some of these are actually very persistent, and they'll chase you all the way to the end of the level, but we can just avoid them all. This is also a very long section, so it kind of tests your stamina management while you dash. Now we're coming up to the next boss, which is Zarvot. And it's, you know, if you ever wondered what a cube's anatomy looks like, this is a skeleton. So this fight has two distinct phases. They're not super different from each other, as most of the bosses are. But basically, it jumps around and shoots you, and then once you get it under half health, it changes color and shoots more, and also creates shockwaves when it lands. So as you can see, it has a much wider range on its shots, and also fires two waves at once. Here, I actually take a safety strat. The chomp, you don't use it much because you try not to take damage or get close to dying to begin with, but chomping an enemy actually restores 1 health, so it can be good in a pinch, since you build a chomp up while you attack enemies. So surprisingly, that was a pretty fast section. It was much slower when we had to skip the waves individually because it was really easy to screw up and have to restart a section. And we did all that for a skateboard. Again, very difficult trick. We have to actually put the skateboard into the present. So, once again, as is common, we're going to go visit Red and make sure that he's doing okay. Spoilers, he's not. Once again, Red is gone, and actually, his apartment is open, which means Red is definitely not here. So this is the point where Charcoal decides to take responsibility and says he's going to go find Red on his own. Unfortunately, this chapter has a nasty little glitch that sometimes you spawn underneath the bridge at the very start. Sometimes you can fix this by restarting, sometimes you can't, and I unfortunately had to redo this several times. Just to kind of show what happens, you die. That's it, you die. Even after you die, you can't get back up. So usually if you can't fix it by restarting the chapter, you can just go back to the menu, which I do end up doing, and then you can just restart the chapter from there, and usually it'll fix the problem. Like I mentioned earlier, sometimes in Red's room that can happen as well. So it would be the same fix, you just exit out and restart. So it's unfortunate, but you know, it's random. Sometimes it happens. You don't lose too much time to it if you catch it early. So this section, normally we'd have to get some scuba gear so we can go underwater, but there's only one underwater section, and there's actually a lot of barriers that we can just sort of stand on for the boundaries. And now we've got something which I call D-pad skip. Basically, we hold down right and we walk along this boundary. And we skip this entire wave, and then we'll go out. And there's another large wave trigger in the center. And you know, the theme with wave triggers is we do not want to activate them. So we want to go to these 3 pillars on the other sides of the wave trigger and sort of cut these corners as tightly as possible so we don't risk activating the wave. And these 3 pillars of light are going to activate a warp to get to the next section. Most of the sections of the chapter progress by activating a warp or otherwise walking into it. So again, we're going to cut this corner very, very tightly and be careful because that particular corner of the wave is a little bit larger in my experience. So here, again, as usual, we're gonna go out of bounds. If you get high enough, you can actually skip all of this. I did not, and you know, I don't personally know all the heights that you need for the individual sections, so I just kind of messed it up here. I didn't even need to, I could have just gone around. But here, we're going to avoid some more enemies again. We see some kind of unique enemies that don't show up in a lot of other places, but we're just going to skip a little bit of area and jump directly into the warp. So this cutscene is where we finally find Red and spam Bible thump in chat, because this is where we learn that Red is very depressed and Red thinks that charcoal can't help. However, we're going to try anyway. So from this section onward, the level sort of changes thematically and visually, and we see a lot of unique enemies that you don't see anywhere else in the game, mostly because it's so late. But again, we've just got to skip some waves. So this is one of the larger wave skips that we have to do. This one's 9. Again, it's very difficult because there's no corner and there's no really visible solid wall to line this up against. So sometimes your angles get messed up. In this instance, I actually just overall messed up and had to redo it. But this is all still faster than actually fighting the wave. This one, I believe, took 9 stairs to get over. It would have been really nice if there was a corner right there, but unfortunately there isn't. So here, as you can see, the entire level is turning red now. So we can skip that first wave just by sort of hugging the boundaries. But here we actually have to do another wave skip with a Stairway to Heaven. And then here, we can just kind of hug the top end and avoid it. Once again, we need to do some wave skips. There's one more wave that we can also skip by just hugging the edge in this section. Here, there are a couple of places where you can set this up pretty easily. I prefer the bottom corner, but the top corner and sort of in between are also pretty good places. And here, we can sort of squeeze our way through by dashing and just sort of caress the edge of the wave without activating it. So this section, there's actually multiple wave triggers for this wave, and originally I would skip over them each, but it actually turns out that it's faster to activate the wave and jump all the way out of bounds to get past the wave and skip the next wave as well, right here. However, there's no good way to get all the way out of bounds here, so we do have to skip this next wave individually, which is unfortunate because it's a very tall wave. We have to get up to, I believe, 11 barriers, and we also have to fall down blind since we can't really judge where our shadow is. So you have to be really precise with your angles to make sure you get through the wave all the way. Here we just kind of ignore a lot of stuff. I actually messed this one up, I believe. If you hug the edge of that wave very tightly, you can just kind of ignore it, even though it activates. But when you dash, it pushes you back slightly because of the way that the collision works. So here you can see I just hugged and went through. And that's the end of the real sections for Chapter 11, but of course, we have a boss fight to deal with. And that boss fight is Red, and Red is not okay. So, Red is simultaneously one of the easiest and most difficult bosses in the game, and it depends entirely on whether you can AI lock him. Luckily, right here I did get a good AI lock. A certain distance away, if you hit the button that starts the spin attack, if you hold that, it turns into Radial Beam, but Red will try to counter with his own spin attack because they cancel out. And while he's closer to you, he'll favor spinning over using the laser or pew pew. So you can just sort of lock him into spinning and not moving while you hit him with Radial Beam, which he is unable to dodge. If you try to use pew pew or other attacks, he can actually dash around. He has all the same controls as you. So he just doesn't use Radial Beam that often. So this cutscene we can skip, which is unfortunate because it's a really important cutscene where Red and Charcoal have a heart-to-heart, but we have to go fast, so we skip it. And with that, the game is largely over, but there is one more chapter with some very important tricks that we have left. There's just not very much combat left, if any. So, Chapter 12, oddly enough, if you're playing in docked mode on a Switch, there are 4 points in the first section, which count as cutscene triggers that automatically crash the game if you're docked. These don't crash the game if you're in handheld mode. And it tries to do this weird camera trick with a split screen effect. It looks really cool, and it's kind of unfortunate. Originally, before the Stairway to Heaven was found, I would actually undock the Switch, and it was legal to undock and redock the Switch to get past the cutscene trigger, and it would look very weird. But since Stairway to Heaven was found, you can actually skip the cutscene triggers and do it without undocking the Switch, which is definitely more single-segment friendly. And on this last one, I'll actually shoot, and you can see where the blast hits the wall, or the blast hits the cutscene trigger, rather, and that's how you can kind of tell where to space yourself to avoid crashing the game. So you just jump over each of the cutscene triggers, and the chapter is basically done. We're going to do a lot of running away from enemies. We've got one more, maybe 2 more waves to skip. Yeah, one right here. Very small wave. There's not really a good place to set it up, so you just kind of have to do it. We do a little bit of movement trick here. We do a barrier and then we dash up this wall to skip a little bit of movement. And now we've got to go meet with Mustard so we can go up to the peak. However, talking with Mustard is very often slow, so we're going to do something that doesn't involve talking to Mustard. We're going to get over the cutscene trigger and talk to this kiosk guy without triggering Mustard's cutscene. And now there are 2 Mustards, and our first Mustard likes to talk more. So now we've got our tickets. I'm not sure what happens to the other Mustard. Legends say that he is still there to this day, waiting for Charcoal to talk. So here, we have kind of an awkward wave skip to do. It's basically the last one in the game. So we get past that wave, and the second wave actually does not have any barriers, so we can just keep going through it and to the end of the section. So now we've got to go into the elevator. I somehow missed it several times. And now we're up at the peak. So at this point, all that's left is waiting for red. We climb up the peak. Lots of jumping, lots of dashing. And now we just wait for red and hope that he shows up. Mustard is not as patient. But we have faith. And look who decided to show up. So, you may have noticed that while we were filling out the present earlier, there was one spot that was still empty. And no, we do not have to find out if we are worthy again. Red happened to collect the banana that we needed to complete the present. So once again, hardest trick in the run, putting the banana in the present. So the run isn't quite over yet, because we still have 3 cutscenes to skip before the end credits. So we're finally having Red's belated birthday party, presenting the present to him, and ignoring all of his dialogue. And that's time. So, this was Zarvot, a game about cubes. The story is very good, which is unfortunate because the speedrun obviously skips a large portion of it. This any percent category skips the vast majority of the combat in the game as well, and turns it basically into a glorified boss rush with a couple of small waves that we do have to deal with. However, I think it's still a pretty fun category, and it's enjoyable to see how many different ways you can get out of bounds and take advantage of the way that the boundaries are set up in a lot of levels. Before the Stairway to Heaven was found, it was actually kind of about an hour and a half of a run. It could have maybe been brought down to an hour 25 or an hour 20, but being able to skip most of the combat in the game just speeds it up so much, because the combat is slow already and just inherently, and so not having to deal with it just makes it a lot faster. And at the very end of the game, we have this weird little scene where we're in a jar and we have to fall off something. And that's Zarvot. Thanks for watching.